Well, anyone who has eyes that see can see that there is a God. Only the blind cannot see it. Just as a piece of art says something about the artist who created it, so too our creation says a lot about our Creator who created it. As Paul explains in Romans, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men, human beings, are without excuse. So all anyone really needs to do is open up their eyes and look at creation, and they will see loud and clear, very brightly, that there is a God. They will see it, as Paul explains, in the things that God has made. Well, one of the most remarkable things God has ever made is the human eye. David Menton, in an article he wrote for Answers in Genesis, notes, the eye is essentially a living video camera of extraordinary sensitivity. The eye, in fact, is so extraordinary that it even caused the great evolutionist Darwin to doubt his dogma. Darwin admitted that to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree. Let me translate that into layman's terms. He's saying that the eye is so amazing that it's hard to believe that it could be created by just mere chance, by the roll of the dice. Unfortunately for Darwin, however, this proof of God's existence that he saw didn't win him over. But it did make him doubt his dogma about evolution. Well, the question is, what about you? When you look out at God's creation, what do you see? Do you see that there's a God? Good. But we want to get beyond even seeing that there is a God. We want to see what Christ sees. When he looked out at the crowds, he looked with what? Compassion, not condemnation. And so the question for you and me is, when we look out at the unbelieving world, do we look like the way Christ does, with compassion or with condemnation? That's the question we will wrestle with today. But Mark tells us very clearly how Christ looked out at the crowds, and he looked at them with compassion. In our gospel reading we just heard, when Christ went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so when Christ looked out at the crowds and he saw them, he didn't look with condemnation, he looked with compassion. He didn't look down on them with a condescending look, but with complete care and concern. In Matthew's version of this story, he adds that they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Unfortunately, most of the clergy of Christ's day did not look at the crowds the way Christ did. While Christ looked out with compassion on the sheep, they did not. For instance, when Christ cured one of his sheep, a man born blind from birth, and he did that on a Sabbath, well, they had a conniption fit. The religious leaders had a conniption fit. And so they decided to investigate. They interviewed the man, then they interviewed his parents, and then they went back and interviewed him. And when he started to defend Jesus, they gave him a lecture. And they said to him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" Well, anyone who has ears that hear and eyes that see, they will hear and see no compassion in the voices of those clergymen. You'll only hear criticism and condemnation. You will only hear their condescending voice and their condescending looks. And so this is one of the areas where Christ and the clergy of his day really clashed. They clashed on the topic of compassion. The question we have to ask ourselves once in a while is this: are we any better? Are we any different? How easy it is for us to look out from inside the church at those outside the church, and to do so with mere criticism and condemnation and nothing like compassion. How easy it is for us to turn on the TV, watch the evening news, or to go on our computer, or to listen to the radio, and simply complain and criticize the sinful crowd that exists around us. Any Sadducee, any hypocrite can go sit in his recliner or her recliner, watch the evening news, and see lots and lots of sin. But that's no great accomplishment. In contrast, Christ did far more than simply see our sin. He actually did something about it. He left his royal recliner, so to speak, and he did something about the sin within us. He got up and did something. Rather than looking down on us with condescension, he came down from heaven and became one of us. And his compassion not only made him suffer with us, his compassion made him suffer for us. He didn't just feel compassion, he had compassion. He acted on it. He lived and died from it. He was full of it. As it says in Psalm 116, our God is full of compassion. Isn't that beautiful? Our God is full of compassion. Jesus' half-brother, St. James, put it like this: the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. So think about this. If our God is full of compassion, and Jesus is God in the flesh, then of course he's going to be the God who is full of compassion. And his crucifixion on the cross confirms it. He is, after all, the compassionate good shepherd who loved us so much that he laid down his life for us. I am the good shepherd, Jesus says in John chapter 10. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. So Jesus is the good shepherd, and as the psalmist tells us in Psalm 100, we are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Whereas the clergy of Christ's day, they were just hired hands who cared little for the sheep. So that when the wolf came, they simply ran away. They did so because they didn't care for the sheep. They didn't care about them because they didn't belong to them. In complete, utter contrast, Christ ran after the sheep when they strayed. He ran after the sheep. He laid down his life for the sheep. He loved the sheep because they were his. He looked on them with compassion while the hired hands looked on them with condemnation. And this explains why the hired hands fled. They didn't chase the lost down, but Jesus did. They were hired hands who cared little for the sheep. Jesus loved the sheep. The sheep belonged to him, and so he ran after them. But the religious leaders did not. And this problem persisted going all the way back to the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah. For we heard in Jeremiah today, you have scattered my flock and have driven them away, and you have not attended to them. Well, several hundred years later, Jeremiah lived around 600, 700 years before Christ. 600-700 years later, things had not changed. The same criticisms that Jeremiah gave, Jesus gave as well. Times had not changed. The sheep were ruled harshly and brutally. They were harassed and helpless because the shepherds who were supposed to shepherd them did not. They went astray because the sheep of their day didn't bring back the stray or look for the lost. They only looked out for themselves. But the good shepherd, of course, did the exact opposite. He looked after the sheep. As God predicted in Ezekiel 34, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. Then the shepherd says to his sheep, you are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture. You are my people, and I am your God. But the good shepherd not only looks for the sheep, his lost sheep, he not only looks after the sheep and feeds them. As we already heard, he laid down his life for the sheep. He did so because while the shepherds of this world didn't care for the sheep, he did. The sheep belonged to him. But here's the thing, let's be honest. It wasn't just the shepherds of Israel who sinned and didn't live up to God's expectations. The same thing applies to us, the sheep of God. And so the shepherd came not only to care for us and protect us, but to save us. As God said and predicted in Isaiah 53, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now notice that plural pronoun, we. Can everyone say we? We. Yeah, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each and every single one of us has turned and gone to his own way. Shepherd and sheep alike, we have all gone astray and gone our own way. But the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Clergy and Christians in the pews alike. Yes, he laid his life down for us even when we didn't live our lives for him. He didn't condemn us even though we could have been condemned. He looked on us with compassion even when we didn't care for him. But here's the thing. We only show what we know. We only show what we know. Meaning, we will only show Christ's compassion when we know Christ's compassion for ourselves. We will look out at the lost with compassion, but only when we first experience Christ's compassion for ourselves. It's like John says, this is love. Not that we love God, but he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. And again, we love because he first loved us. We love because he first loved us. And so too, we're only going to show compassion to the crowd outside the church when we first experience his compassion for ourselves. He initiates, we respond. He shows us compassion, and then and only then do we show compassion. And that's when we will show what we know. We will be like Christ, and when we look out at the crowds, we will look out at them with compassion, just like Christ did. Because we have his compassion within us, and when we have his compassion within us, it goes outside of us. And we will look at the masses out there, the crowds out there, and we will see that they look harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And it is your calling and my calling to tell the people of this world that there is a shepherd who cares for them, who looks on them with compassion. And all of God's people said, Amen.